The Fall and the Rise. The year is 476 AD. The Roman Empire collapses. For centuries, it had brought order, commerce, and law across Europe. But now, that world is gone. Imagine being a merchant in Rome. Your trade routes disappear. Your security vanishes. The armies that protected you are no more. You feel alone, abandoned. In this moment of chaos, there is silence. And in that silence, something unexpected happens. A new power rises, not through swords but through words. The Church. While kings fight for territory, a different kind of authority emerges. Bishops, monks, and priests hold something precious in this dark time. They can read. They can write. They can remember. In a world drowning in illiteracy, this simple skill becomes extraordinary power. A young farmer cannot read the laws that bind him to the land. A noble cannot write his own contracts. A king cannot preserve his own legacy. But the Church? The Church remembers everything. The Church speaks for God. This is not just religion, this is survival. And the people cling to it.
Faith as a weapon. A mother watches her child die from plague. She has no medicine, no explanation. A priest tells her, "Trust in God. Pray. Your faith will save you." She has no other choice. She prays. This is the reality of medieval life: fear, suffering, and faith intertwined. For ordinary people, the church was not just a building. It was hope. It was community. It was the only place where their suffering meant something. Kings understood this. They saw that the church held people's hearts in ways armies never could. So they made a bargain: bless my throne, and I will protect your church. The Pope would anoint a king, declaring him chosen by God. In return, the king would do the Pope's bidding. Both gained power. Both needed each other. And both, in different ways, controlled the people. But not everyone accepted this.
The voices of dissent. In the mountains of the Alps, a man named Peter Waldo walked away from his wealth. He gave everything to the poor. He read the Bible and asked dangerous questions. Why does the church need such riches? Why can't ordinary people read God's word themselves? His followers, the Waldensians, spread across Europe. They lived simply. They preached freely. They believed in the direct connection between a person and God. For this, they were hunted. Imagine fleeing through snow-covered mountains because of your faith. Imagine watching your neighbor disappear because someone whispered your name to the Inquisition. This was the reality for thousands. They were not criminals. They were just people who wanted to think for themselves.
The Black Death and the BREAKDOWN. The plague arrives. It comes suddenly. Entire families die in days. A healthy person in the morning is buried by evening. Streets become mass graves. The smell of death fills the air. In Paris, so many die that mass graves cannot contain them. In some villages, no one survives to bury the dead. People are terrified. Where is the church's protection? Where is God's mercy? A young priest, exhausted, buries the 100th body that week. He has lost his faith, but he keeps performing the rituals because people still need him. An old woman lights candles for her entire family, all dead. She asks herself, what did we do to deserve this? For the first time in generations, people begin to doubt. Not just doubt the church, but doubt everything they were taught. The plague kills almost everyone you know. But it also kills the old order.
The Knights Templar, mystery and power. Across Europe, a different kind of warrior rises. The Knights Templar. They began as humble protectors of pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, but they became something far more powerful: bankers, landowners, warriors, administrators of massive wealth. A merchant needs money for trade? He goes to the Templars. A king needs funds for war? The Templars loan it to him. They operate a financial network centuries before modern banking exists. Their wealth rivals that of kingdoms. A young Templar knight stands guard over treasures in a hidden vault. He wonders about the ancient manuscripts locked away here. What secrets do they contain? What do the leaders know that common people don't? Rumors spread. Some say the Templars possess forbidden knowledge. Others claim they're heretics in disguise. Nobody knows the truth, but everyone fears them. In 1307, King Philip IV of France acts. He is drowning in debt to the Templars. He accuses them of witchcraft and heresy. Knights are arrested, tortured, forced to confess impossible crimes. By 1312, the Pope, under pressure, dissolves the order. What happens to their treasure? Where do their secrets go? History never answers. Only mystery remains. The light in the darkness. But there is another side to this story. In quiet monasteries, monks work by candlelight. Their hands are cold. Their eyes strain. For hours, they copy manuscripts, ancient Greek texts, mathematical treatises, medical knowledge. They are not trying to change the world. They are simply trying to preserve it. A young scholar in a monastery discovers a text on mathematics written 1,000 years ago. His heart races. This is what we've lost. This is what we must reclaim. Slowly, across Europe, small networks of knowledge form. Universities begin to emerge: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca. A student walks through the streets of Paris to attend a lecture. He is poor. His family saved for years to send him to university. He sits in a crowded hall, listening to a teacher explain Aristotle's logic. For the first time, he feels alive. His mind awakens to possibilities. This is the birth of a new Europe, one that questions, thinks, and seeks understanding.
The clash of powers. The 1300s bring a crisis that shakes Christendom to its core. The papal seat moves to Avignon, a city in France. For 70 years, the Pope no longer rules from Rome. Then, the unthinkable happens: 3 popes claim authority simultaneously, each excommunicating the other. An elderly priest in a small village has no idea which pope is legitimate. What does he teach his congregation? Which pope speaks for God? The moral authority of the church fractures. People feel betrayed. Meanwhile, kings grow stronger. They centralize power. They build standing armies. They assert that their authority comes not just from the pope, but from their own strength and from the people. This tension, between religious and secular power, becomes the defining conflict of the age.
The seeds of rebellion. By the 1400s, the cracks in the medieval system are impossible to ignore. A Czech priest named Jan Hus preaches reform. He argues that the church has lost its way. His followers listen. His enemies listen too. He is burned at the stake. But his ideas survive. A young woman in a small town hears about Hus. She begins to question what she has been taught. She whispers her doubts to her sister. These whispers multiply. From person to person. From town to town. The church feels the threat but cannot stop it. For the first time, ordinary people, not just scholars and nobles, are asking questions about authority, faith, and truth. The stage is set. Legacy: what the Middle Ages left us. The Middle Ages officially end. The modern world begins. But the medieval world didn't disappear, it transformed. We inherit their institutions, universities, hospitals, legal systems. We inherit their stories: the noble knight, the sacred quest, the battle between good and evil. We inherit their questions about faith, power, and human purpose. And we inherit their unresolved tensions. The conflict between individual conscience and institutional authority? Born in the Middle Ages. The struggle between faith and reason? Fought then. The tension between secular and religious power? Defined then. The tension between centralized authority and local autonomy? Established then. The human story. The Middle Ages were not simply dark. They were human. They were a period where ordinary people, peasants, monks, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, struggled to survive, to believe, to hope, to resist, and to imagine something better. They were a period where ideas slowly challenged power, where knowledge was preserved in the margins, where faith became both comfort and chains, where individuals dared to ask dangerous questions, knowing the cost might be everything. This is the real story of the Middle Ages. Not just the story of kings and popes, but the story of us, our ancestors, wrestling with the same questions we face today. How do we live with integrity? How do we resist unjust power? How do we preserve what matters while embracing what's new? How do we find meaning in uncertain times? The medieval people had no better answers than we do. But they kept asking. And in that asking, they changed the world. Rise of the papacy. By the 13th century, the papacy had reached heights that no other institution in Europe could rival. Its influence stretched across kingdoms, from the cold forests of Scandinavia to the sun-baked plains of Spain. Yet, with great power came inevitable conflict. The same authority that crowned emperors also clashed with them. The struggle between secular and spiritual power became the defining feature of medieval Europe. One of the most famous confrontations occurred between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict, known as the investiture controversy, was rooted in a question both simple and profound. Who had the right to appoint bishops? Could kings control the church within their territories, or did the Pope alone hold this divine prerogative? The stakes were enormous, for bishops controlled lands, wealth, and armies. To control them was to control the soul of Europe itself. Henry IV believed the emperor's authority allowed him to appoint bishops. Gregory VII, however, claimed that no king had the right to interfere in spiritual matters. The confrontation escalated into a dramatic showdown at Canossa in 1077. The emperor, humiliated and desperate, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging the Pope's forgiveness. This image, an emperor bending before a spiritual leader, symbolized the extraordinary reach of papal power. Yet power breeds opposition. Many rulers resented the Pope's ability to depose kings, excommunicate monarchs, and launch crusades at will. Throughout the centuries, the papacy would face rebellions, assassinations, and challenges from within its own ranks. Popes were not always saints or scholars. Some were ambitious politicians, skilled in intrigue, willing to manipulate kingdoms to maintain supremacy. The Crusades, holy wars or political machines. The Crusades exemplified both the spiritual zeal and the political ambition of the papacy. Beginning in 1095, Pope Urban II called Christian Europe to arms to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. He painted a vision of salvation, promising remission of sins to those who took up the cross. Yet beneath this holy veneer, the Crusades served multiple purposes: consolidating papal authority over European kings, redirecting the violence of knights and nobles away from local conflicts, establishing Christian dominion in strategic territories, expanding trade routes and influence. The First Crusade was a rare success, capturing Jerusalem in 1099, but the campaigns that followed were often disastrous. Thousands died from disease, famine, and battle, yet the Pope's moral authority expanded. The Church portrayed itself as the ultimate moral and military arbiter, able to direct the lives and deaths of thousands. The Inquisition and the control of faith. While Crusades projected power abroad, the Church consolidated authority at home through the Inquisition. Established initially to combat heresy, it became a mechanism to enforce orthodoxy and protect papal influence. Heretics, witches, and dissenters were tried, often tortured, and punished publicly. Fear became a tool. Knowledge was controlled. Books and writings that contradicted church doctrine were banned. Entire communities were scrutinized. Movements such as the Waldensians and the Cathars challenged church authority. Their emphasis on personal piety, rejection of ecclesiastical wealth, and alternative interpretations of Scripture threatened the papacy. The response was swift and brutal. Crusades were launched against them, villages were destroyed, and survivors were forced underground. Yet even in persecution, the seeds of dissent persisted, sowing the soil for future reformations. The Schisma do Occidente, Pope against Pope. By the late 14th century, the Church faced its greatest internal crisis, the Western Schism. With the papacy divided between Rome and Avignon, and later a third rival pope in Pisa, Europe was left bewildered. Kings chose allegiances based on politics, not faith, and the moral authority of the Church was deeply eroded. What had once been an unquestionable spiritual power now appeared fractured and vulnerable. For decades, Europe witnessed popes excommunicating each other, undermining the very notion of divine authority that had elevated the papacy centuries before. Papal ambition and corruption. The medieval papacy was not only spiritual but intensely political. Some popes amassed wealth, engaged in wars, and lived lives of luxury. Cardinals formed powerful families, manipulating elections to control the Church. Popes like Boniface VIII and Innocent VIII exemplified this duality, spiritual shepherds on one hand, cunning rulers on the other. Territories such as the Papal States in central Italy were governed like kingdoms. Taxes, armies, and laws were imposed by the Church. The papacy had become a monarchy in all but name, with both spiritual and temporal authority intertwined inextricably. The beginning of decline and the path to reformation. By the 15th century, cracks in papal supremacy became evident. Humanist scholars criticized corruption, rulers increasingly resisted papal control, and the calls for reform grew louder. While the Church remained powerful, its unquestioned authority had begun to erode. The Inquisition, political intrigue, and wars revealed a human institution capable of both spiritual guidance and political manipulation. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic shifts in European history, the Reformation. But every challenge, every schism, every act of power and brutality in the centuries before had laid the groundwork for this inevitable upheaval. The medieval papacy, at the height of its power, had unknowingly sown the seeds of its own transformation. The rise of the papacy. As the 15th century unfolded, the medieval papacy faced both internal and external pressures. Internally, the Church wrestled with centuries of accumulated wealth, political intrigues, and the moral failings of its leaders. Externally, Europe was changing. Monarchs like Louis XI of France and Henry VII of England sought to centralize power within their realms, resisting interference from Rome. Trade and commerce were expanding, bringing new wealth and new ideas to cities like Venice, Florence, and Bruges. The Church, once the uncontested arbiter of law, morality, and intellect, now had to contend with forces beyond its control. Intellectual resistance and universities. Universities, first fostered under papal authority, had evolved into centers of learning that sometimes questioned the very institution that created them. Scholars studied ancient texts from Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world, reintroducing critical thought, science, and philosophy. Figures like Petrarch and Erasmus championed humanist ideas, emphasizing the value of reason, empirical observation, and the potential of the individual. While the Church tried to maintain oversight, it could not completely suppress intellectual inquiry. The printed book, emerging in the mid-15th century thanks to Johannes Gutenberg, revolutionized the spread of knowledge. For the first time, ideas could travel faster than papal decrees. This was a pivotal development. Knowledge was no longer contained in monasteries or secret libraries. It could reach the hands of anyone who could read. The people and local resistance. Even as popes commanded armies and levied taxes, ordinary people grew increasingly aware of the Church's excesses. Taxes, tithes, and indulgences burdened peasants, merchants, and nobility alike. Local clergy, in some cases, were corrupt, greedy, or indifferent to the spiritual needs of their communities. Movements that began centuries earlier, like the Waldensians and Lollards, persisted. Their emphasis on simple faith, reading scripture, and rejecting clerical opulence gained followers across Europe. They were often persecuted, yet their ideas planted seeds of reform that would later explode during the Reformation. The fall of the Templars and its legacy. The Templars, though suppressed in the early 14th century, left a lasting imprint on European politics and the Church's image. Their sudden downfall, orchestrated by King Philip IV of France and sanctioned by Pope Clement V, demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful institutions to political pressure. The Church's willingness to persecute its own allies for convenience sowed doubt. Could the papacy be trusted? Could spiritual authority be corrupted by earthly ambition? This incident marked a turning point. People began to question whether the Church represented divine guidance or the ambitions of men. Rumors of secret knowledge, hidden treasures, and political manipulation circulated widely, feeding the growing skepticism. The schisma and fragmentation. The Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, intensified doubts about papal authority. With multiple popes claiming legitimacy, excommunications flying back and forth, and kingdoms choosing sides, the moral credibility of the Church suffered. The papacy, once seen as the ultimate spiritual authority, now appeared fallible, vulnerable, and deeply human. Attempts at reform within the Church, such as the Councils of Constance and Basel, aimed to resolve the schism and assert conciliar authority over the Pope, but these efforts only highlighted the tension between institutional power and spiritual mission. Papal politics and temporal power. By the late Middle Ages, popes like Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, epitomized both the grandeur and the corruption of the papacy. Alexander's reign was marked by political scheming, nepotism, and lavish displays of wealth. His family wielded influence over territories and European politics. While some popes like Innocent III had used authority to unify Christendom, others now used it to enrich themselves and their families, undermining moral credibility. The Church controlled armies, levied taxes, and governed cities, yet it faced an increasing gap between its proclaimed spiritual mission and its political ambitions. This duality, visible to both rulers and commoners, set the stage for the coming centuries of reform, rebellion, and religious transformation. The Age of Transition. Despite the papacy's immense power, cracks were everywhere. Humanist scholars, city-states, rising monarchs, and grassroots religious movements slowly eroded unquestioned authority. People began to expect accountability, moral integrity, and intellectual engagement from those who claimed to speak for God. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Church had achieved greatness unimaginable in the 5th century. It ruled kingdoms, crowned emperors, commanded armies, and shaped laws. Yet it also faced unprecedented scrutiny, doubt, and criticism. The seeds of the Reformation had been sown over centuries of power, ambition, conflict, and moral complexity. Conclusion of the medieval papacy. The medieval papacy represents one of history's most fascinating and paradoxical institutions. It was at once a spiritual guide and a temporal monarch, a unifying force and a source of division, a protector of faith and a master of political intrigue. The rise of the papacy illustrates the extraordinary ways in which human ambition, belief, and circumstance can intertwine to shape the destiny of continents. The Church of the Middle Ages laid the foundation for modern Europe, not only through its spiritual influence, but through law, education, diplomacy, and governance. Its triumphs and failures, its saints and sinners, its popes and rebels, all became part of a vast narrative that continues to echo in the structures of power and belief today. The rise of the papacy. As the 15th century drew to a close, the medieval papacy reached a paradoxical moment of unmatched authority and mounting vulnerability. On one hand, the Pope remained the supreme moral and political arbiter in Europe, able to crown emperors, arbitrate disputes between kings, and command armies. On the other hand, the Church faced growing scrutiny, widespread criticism, and simmering discontent among intellectuals, rulers, and ordinary believers. The papacy's temporal power, exercised through the Papal States, had become an empire within an empire. Popes such as Sixtus IV and Alexander VI exemplified the political and often morally questionable dimensions of the office. Nepotism, lavish spending, and political intrigue were widespread. The papacy now operated like a Renaissance kingdom, with courtiers, diplomats, armies, and even secret alliances designed to manipulate European politics. Yet the spiritual mission of the Church, the very reason for its existence, was increasingly questioned. Many perceived a growing gap between the lofty ideals preached from the pulpit and the actions of the papal court. Scandals, corruption, and indulgences fueled skepticism. Writers, scholars, and reform-minded clerics began to demand accountability, transparency, and a return to the core values of faith. Intellectual and religious pressure. Universities and scholars continued to challenge the Church intellectually. Humanists such as Erasmus of Rotterdam advocated for moral reform, emphasizing the need for education, reason, and direct engagement with Scripture. The invention of the printing press in 1450 revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge, breaking the Church's monopoly on literacy and textual authority. Books and ideas spread across Europe faster than papal edicts, allowing dissenting voices to reach far beyond isolated monasteries or urban elites. Meanwhile, religious movements persisted among the common people. The Waldensians in the Alps, the Lollards in England, and other local reformers maintained their focus on simplicity, morality, and access to the Bible. Though often persecuted, they kept alive the notion that faith could exist outside the direct control of Rome. These grassroots movements represented a silent undercurrent of resistance, a moral and spiritual pressure on the Church to change. The Inquisition and the management of power. The Inquisition, once a tool to combat heresy, became emblematic of the Church's tension between justice and control. Entire communities were monitored. Trials and punishments served both religious and political purposes. The Inquisition ensured that dissent was dangerous, yet paradoxically, it also highlighted the limits of papal authority. Even fear could not eliminate skepticism or suppress reformist ideas entirely. Meanwhile, European monarchs increasingly resisted papal intervention. Kings sought to consolidate national power, often clashing with Rome over taxation, appointments, and legal jurisdiction. The Church was no longer the uncontested force it had been in the 12th century. Its influence was now negotiated, contested, and sometimes resisted openly. The final centuries of medieval papal dominance. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the papacy had evolved into a complex institution balancing spiritual authority with worldly power. Popes like Julius II, the warrior pope, personally led armies into battle to defend papal territories. Political diplomacy, alliances, and even secret agreements with secular rulers became routine. The papacy was no longer merely a spiritual guide. It had become a sovereign state, a political power, and a symbol of both divine authority and human ambition. Yet the very success of the papacy had set the stage for its vulnerability. Its wealth, political manipulation, and occasional moral failures created a growing chorus of criticism. Humanist writers, scholars, and reformers demanded a return to spiritual authenticity. The stage was now set for one of the most transformative periods in European history, the Protestant Reformation. What had taken centuries to build, the immense spiritual and temporal authority of the Pope, would be tested as never before. Legacy of the medieval papacy. The medieval papacy left an indelible mark on Europe. Religion, its centralized Christian belief, codified doctrine, and unified Europe under one spiritual framework. Politics, it influenced the rise of nations, shaped royal legitimacy, and arbitrated wars. Education, it preserved knowledge, founded universities, and fostered scholarship. Culture, it shaped art, architecture, literature, and the very symbols of European identity. Law, canon law structured moral and legal codes that influenced secular governance. Even as criticism grew and reformers emerged, the papacy's role in shaping medieval society was unparalleled. Its successes and failures, its saints and sinners, its vision and ambition remain a testament to the extraordinary interplay of faith, power, and human nature. The Church of the Middle Ages was not merely an institution, it was a force that shaped kingdoms, defined culture, and controlled the hearts and minds of millions. Its legacy would ripple across centuries, preparing the world for the seismic changes of the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the modern era.